Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Invasive Mussel Collaborative webinar, Methods and Protocols for Decontaminating Field Gear and Equipment. This is Erica Jensen with the Great Lakes Commission, and on behalf of the Invasive Mussel Collaborative, I want to thank you for participating in today's webinar. For those of you who aren't familiar, the Invasive Mussel Collaborative was convened in 2015 to identify opportunities to advance scientifically sound technology for management and control of invasive Dreisseniid mussels in order to produce measurable ecological and economic benefits. If you'd like to know more about the Invasive Mussel Collaborative, we encourage you to visit the website at www.invasivemusselcollaborative.net. We also encourage you to join our listserv to receive webinar announcements, read about recent Dreisseniid-related news, and connect with other researchers and managers. A link to join the listserv is provided on our website. Today's webinar is part of an ongoing series hosted by the Collaborative. The purpose of the webinars is to facilitate learning and information sharing on topics of common interest within the invasive mussel community. It will be recorded and archived along with past and future webinars on the website. The focus of today's webinar is disinfection and decontamination in the field. The original idea for this webinar was generated following a question which was posed to the Invasive Mussel Collaborative listserv regarding effective decontamination methods for field work where hot or pressurized water may not be available. And I believe this question was first asked by one of our presenters today, Kelly Pennington with Minnesota DNR. But this request yielded quite a bit of traffic and response over the email list, including several requests to compile the responses and information for distribution. This eventually led to the Mussel Collaborative developing what is referred to as a quick guide of available decontamination methods for use in fieldwork, and these methods are ones that are effective specifically against zebra and quagga mussels. The guide covers a variety of methods, including both chemical and non-chemical options, and it includes an appendix for guidance about other aquatic invasive species that may be susceptible to the methods outlined in the main guide. This quick guide is now available on the Invasive Mussel Collaborative website and can be accessed by navigating the Researchers and Managers page under the Prevention tab. Through the process of developing this quick guide, several relevant efforts were brought to light, which are going to be featured on today's webinar. The presentations today will provide an overview of decontamination protocols, including development and implementation of those protocols from a state agency perspective. We are pleased to have representatives from the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources joining us to give those presentations. Before I introduce our first presenter, I do have a couple logistical items to cover. We are pleased to have over 100 people registered for the webinar this afternoon, and due to the large number of people participating, all attendees' lines are on mute, and they will remain on mute throughout the webinar. We will be taking questions, and we'll take those written. So if you have a question, you may type it into the question pane of the GoToWebinar dashboard. These questions may be submitted at any time during the webinar, and depending on time, we may answer one or two questions following each presentation, but otherwise, all questions will be held to the end of the webinar after all three presentations have been given. We'll do our best to answer all questions and respond to all comments during the webinar. If you need to leave before we've gotten to your question, we encourage you to review the webinar recording that will be posted on our website to hear your question and answer at a later time. You may also follow up with us via email. If you're experiencing technical difficulties, you may send a chat directly to the Great Lakes Commission listed as an organizer for this webinar. We'll do our very best to help you. So with that, our first presenter this afternoon is Maureen Ferry. Maureen is the statewide aquatic invasive species monitoring coordinator for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. She provides guidance to lake, stream, and wetland biologists as well as the citizen-based monitoring programs. She's studied zebra mussel habitat selection, growth, and mortality during her master's research with the Wisconsin Cooperative Fishery Research Unit at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point. Previously, Maureen chaired a cooperative invasive species management area and conducted rare plant surveys for the Forest Service and other land managers. So with that, Maureen, you should have control of the presentation and can get started as soon as you're ready. And I believe you're still on mute, Maureen.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
There you go.
Well, thanks for the opportunity to be here today. So I'm going to talk a little more broader than just about invasive mussels. I'm going to share with you today about our boat gear and equipment decontamination and disinfection manual code that all of our staff follow within the state. So you all are familiar with the general prevention messages. On the right is the Stop Aquatic Hitchhiker campaign, and on the left you'll see a sign that we have at all of the boat landings at the state of Wisconsin that tells boaters they need to inspect, remove, drain, and never move plants or animals from lake to lake. And then we have these watercraft inspector volunteers that sit out at all the boat landings, preventing the spread of movement from recreational boaters from lake to lake. But our staff have more complicated equipment than the recreational boaters. We've got these nets, we have shocker boats, and heavy equipment that we bring into lakes. So we impose upon ourselves a manual code that all of our staff have to follow. We actually developed it in 2007 after the discovery of VHS, and then it was recently updated just this past year following new discoveries in the state like New Zealand mud snails, Asian clam, and faucet snails. And then we made this a requirement of anybody who's working as an agent of the state, so not just our staff, but we ask our agents, contractors, permittees, anyone doing work on our behalf that we allow to do work for us to clean their equipment also. They follow this manual code. The manual code asks them to decontaminate, which is essentially what all the public does. It's the clean, drain, dry, inspect, remove, drain, and dispose of plants and animals. But we also have to disinfect our equipment by one of the four following: drying equipment for 5 days, using steam or hot water, using 500 part per million chlorine bleach, or using 2% Virkon. And I'll go into more detail on those later. Before staff go out, we ask them to do these four things. They have to review the manual code, review our best management practices document, check to know what invasive species are known to be present in the waters that they're going to be working on, and then select the best disinfection method for that species. And we allow them the option to choose because some are going to be more challenging than others. So this slide is kind of busy, but this is a screenshot of a website that we created. If you go to the DNR website and you Google search for disinfection, this is the first link that will pop up. The first place we ask them to check is to review the manual code. It's one of the links that I have highlighted here. It brings you to a PDF that looks like this. It outlines step by step everything involved with the manual code, including the disinfection steps that they have to follow. And I'll go into those in more detail later. And then to review the best management practices document, this is a more than 20-page document that gets into all the intricacies because our manual code of cleaning equipment, there's lots of different sizes of equipment, there's lots of different methods and lots of caveats. So we ask that everybody review this document to become fully aware of what it is that they're dealing with. And this is what the first page of the BMP document looks like, and the contents outline the introduction, the general practices which you have to be aware of, the disinfection specific practices, so that's using those four different methods, the gear specific practices, and then we have tables with supporting information that I'll share with you that helps them decide which method that they need to choose. Then they need to check for what species is present before they go out sampling for a day. A lot of our staff will hit 3 or 4 water bodies within a single day. So they need to check before they go out what species are present so that they can sample from the least invaded to the most invaded, and then also choose the appropriate disinfection method as they go along from site to site. We have on our website 2 different links that they can get to that show you spatial and tabular data for where all of the occurrences we know are present in the state of Wisconsin. So you can Google on the DNR website AIS efforts, and this data and maps bar that you see on the right side will appear, and those 2 highlighted links bring you to the following pages that I'll show you. So when you click on that second link, the lakes and rivers with aquatic invasive species, they can find water bodies in every county, every water body in the state, and that way it's ordered by county. They can also sort it by the WIBIC or sort it by the water body name, but it'll tell them what the water body name is, their unique identifier code, and then list all the species that are known to be present in that lake. There's also the other link that was highlighted on that website, which brings them directly to a mapping tool. And this one's a little more complicated to use because there's a lot of layers involved. They can turn on the layer of every single species. It's going to have a different color code and symbology, but then that's a quicker way to see if you're working within a certain part of the state. You can turn on and off all of the layers and see what species are known to be present. And then they need to select the best disinfection method for that species. Not all methods are going to kill all species. We found that out with the discovery of New Zealand mud snails. When they showed up, we were afraid to send our staff out into Black Earth Creek to look for them, and then to look throughout the driftless area to see where else New Zealand mud snails were going to be, because we knew how transferable they were. When we talked to people out west, they said they figured it was their biologist who did spread a lot of them because they weren't using the appropriate disinfection method. So then we started reading literature, and then we realized we didn't have the whole story for all the species that we were dealing with in the state. We reviewed about 86 different scientific publications, and then we compiled all that information into these tables. And I've got several slides to walk you through this, but we have it organized by species in each row. So this is the table that we have so far for the invertebrates. There's faucet snails, New Zealand mud snails, quagga, adults and veligers, and so on. And then we've got a column for each one of the disinfection methods that are included in our manual code. So that includes steam, hot water, drying, chlorine, Virkon, and we included freezing because that's what we had tried using with the New Zealand mud snails, although it's not included as an option in our manual code because it's not effective against fish pathogens. The green checks means that that method is effective, the red X means it's not effective, and a blue R means that more research is needed. These superscripts are reference to a citation that we use to get that information, and then we've got a list of those 80 plus scientific articles that we reviewed to put this together. And then we also included footnotes with additional information, just additional details, because there are so many caveats when you're working with disinfection in all these species. And then we wanted to point out that most of our staff had been using chlorine, a chlorine spray actually, and not a chlorine soak. And chlorine isn't effective to kill faucet snails, New Zealand mud snails, Asian clam, or the spiny water flea resting eggs. And I think that's what a lot of agency staff tend to use, so it's good to highlight that this was a hurdle for us. So these next slides just illustrate the process. So you first need to decontaminate. This is what all recreational boaters have to do. It's mandatory in the state of Wisconsin. You inspect, remove, and drain using a stiff bristled brush to make sure all the sediments are removed. And then disinfect using one of the 4 following options. And I'll go through each. So the first is drying. We ask that they first use soap and water, make sure everything is cleaned off, all the sediments, and then once they know it's completely clean, let it store dry completely for 5 days. This is just a picture of what they have at the fish hatchery, where they've got different places where they can hang up all of their waders and their nets and their gloves. And then they have to use hot water, steam, 140 degrees or the 220 degree steam. The steam is preferred because it's going to be more effective always than just the hot water. And we had to let staff know that car washes are not hot enough because a lot of staff were relying on the car washes. And then we also identify what personal protective equipment is needed for using the hot water. These are little handheld Jiffy steamers, which a lot of our science staff had used for a while, and we're just started testing these on New Zealand mud snails to see if they even clean them. I don't know if anyone has familiarity with these, but they're just little poofs of heat. We did find that they were able to kill New Zealand mud snails when we had the steamer right up to them. They killed them at 15 seconds, 10 seconds, and 5 seconds. At 1 second of steam, there was maybe a half mortality. Otherwise, it was 100% kill. But we're going to continue studying with this because it's more practical for our stream biologists to use and for our wetland biologists. For chlorine, there's a lot of caveats with this too. We have to consider the shelf life. Once you've mixed the chlorine, it's only good for 24 hours. We increased the rate of chlorine from what we had been using to the 500 part per million to be effective for the faucet and New Zealand mud snails. To get that 500 part per million, you have to be careful and check the label concentration because they're all going to be different. And we do have a table available on our website that shows what the initial concentration is of the store-bought chlorine, and then what the mixture should be with water to get it to that appropriate concentration. And we ask that staff soak it for 10 minutes to kill those organisms. And they have to use sodium thiosulfate to neutralize the bleach. And then rinse with tap water because it can degrade equipment. And then for the safety equipment, we have to have an emergency eye wash station with this, eye protection, nitrile gloves, and to stay upwind of the spray. For the Virkon Aquatic, you also have to consider the shelf life, and they do offer test strips for Virkon as well as the chlorine. We mix a 2-to-1 solution. It's about 5.4 tablespoons of the Virkon mix with a gallon of water, and we have to soak it for 20 minutes. All of our equipment completely soaked. If you see in the picture, we have the tub of Virkon. It's labeled with Virkon, and the red tub of the Virkon, they say the 20-minute soak, and they give you what the concentration should be. These are what they have at the hatchery, just so that everybody knows what the mixtures should be and the time for when they're using it. The safety is a little stricter with that. Same as the bleach, we use the eye wash station, eye protection, nitrile gloves. With Virkon, you also have to use splash goggles or a face shield while mixing it. And respirators are advised, but they have to have certain training for that. And just like the bleach, you have to stay upwind of the spray. So that's the whole method for what we do. This is one of my last slides. If you go to that same DNR website, search disinfection, we have a couple other links with questions and answers for not just our staff, but the other people who are affected by this, and then as well as an implementation chart just so they know who they are. And we're putting together a training video next week, and we should have it put together by June, and we can share that out with the Invasive Mussel Collaborative too. Just to show all the work that put into this, this was a cross-program effort within the DNR. It was every department within our agency that worked together to compile this information and to revise the manual code and develop the best management practices. But I think we're holding questions until the end, Erica. That's all I had.
Thanks, Maureen. Yeah, we don't have any questions yet. So I'm going to go ahead and move to our next presenter. Our next presenter is Tom Alwin. Tom is an aquatic biologist in the Michigan Department of Environmental Quality's Aquatic Invasive Species Program. His work focuses on prevention and early detection of aquatic invasive species in Michigan surface waters through outreach, education, and monitoring. So Tom, you should be all set to go.
All right. Thank you, Erica. Can everyone hear me, or you guys can hear me at least? Good. All right. Well, hello, everybody. I'm excited to be here today to present on Michigan's multi-agency invasive species decontamination policy. And the key word here for this one is multi-agency. Invasive species, as you guys know, are a cross-cutting issue, and the state of Michigan's quality of life agencies have been taking a collaborative approach to addressing them. So I'll talk a little bit about the agencies and how we're organized, and then I'll go into how that policy came to be. This picture here is a good example representing how this is built. I mentioned quality of life agencies, and those three agencies are pictured at the top. It's the Department of Agriculture and Rural Development, the Department of Natural Resources, and the Department of Environmental Quality. And these three groups work together on a number of things, including invasive species. As far as invasive species go, the next level down is a steering committee, and that steering committee is made up of senior management within the departments and divisions, and they sort of establish priorities, approve budget allocations, provide governance, those sort of things. And then below that are the core teams, and there's an aquatic and a terrestrial, and these are the staff in the divisions that are working in the programs that might be impacted or be impacted by invasive species. And since this is the Invasive Mussel Collaborative, I'll be focusing on the Aquatic Invasive Species Core Team. That's also the group that I work in. And then actually not pictured here is the next level down, which are work groups. And there are a number of work groups working on specific topics. And some of the work groups have members from both core teams working on them. A good example of that is the decontamination work group. So going into the aquatic invasive species core team, just a quick look at it. It was established in 2010. You'll see the 3 departments are the main bullets, and then underneath that are divisions. Within those departments, that there's representation on the core team, and some groups have more than one person, some others. But what you can really see here is the diversity of work once you start looking at these different groups that's being done across the state, and how they may have different needs as far as decontamination or invasive species. So something to point out that I'll bring up more is that broad range of work that folks are doing. You know, folks out in the forest, managing forests versus folks out on lakes. So clearly, you know, even the forest folks are getting in the water sometimes as they're crossing streams, so they can have an impact on aquatics. And you also notice that I have the Department of Transportation down here with an asterisk. They are not technically in the quality of life group, so they are not bound to the core team, but they do have representatives who come to the core team and participate, and they're eager to do work on invasive species to prevent their spread as well. So really one of the main first accomplishments of the aquatic core team was the development of the state management plan. And there was actually a previous plan, so they updated it, but it was a pretty heavy lift and a major revision. And that's become sort of the roadmap for the program and guides us on what we're doing. It has 4 main goals that are presented up on the screen here. And it used an interesting approach. Rather than going on a species-specific angle, it took a vector pathway approach. So looking at how to slow or stop the spread of invasive species by how they move rather than focusing on individual species. And goals 1 and 2 are really the 2 that link closely with the disinfection, decontamination information. So those 4 goals are pretty lofty, and they're broken down into objectives, and those objectives are then broken down into strategic actions. And objective 5A within the plan is to prevent introductions and limit the dispersal of aquatic invasive species through state policies, procedures, and permits. So that objective boils down then to this next strategic action, which we have on the screen, and that is sort of the way and the impetus that the decontamination policy came about. So getting onto the decontamination policy itself, again, it covers all 3 of the departments and all of the field staff in those departments. Excuse me. The policy itself is only 5 pages. It's fairly brief, but it's written in policy language, which I don't really like so much. But what I really like about this policy is the guidance document, which comes afterwards as an appendix. And it sounds a lot like what Maureen was talking about with the best management practices. It talks about how to do decontamination, how to assess your risk of spreading invasive species, and things like that. And I have a link on this page that'll take you right to that PDF of the decontamination policy along with the guidance document. And then my last bullet is just sort of a fun fact that this policy is the 2nd quality of life wide policy, so spanning all 3 agency departments. The first one was also invasive species. It was for early detection and response. So just kind of a fun fact for everybody. So the policy, I said, is only 5 pages, so not a heavy read, but I've tried to boil it down and pulled some language out of it to really capture the gist of it, sort of what I consider the cliff notes, and then underline some important information on it. And really what it's trying to do here is get folks to do basic decontamination to minimize the risk. And then the second portion is really important as well. Since we have such a broad range of folks doing both aquatic and terrestrial work that could be moving invasive species around, we try to make this policy sort of flexible and have folks make that determination of what worked best for them and what they were able to accomplish to do decontamination. So it's flexible for different types of work, really. And of course, that wide range is one of the challenges that this policy and guidance document have to tackle. The other two, I'll talk about all three of these here in a moment. Implementation, so basically getting folks to do that decontamination, and then tools to succeed. So if you need folks to do some sort of work, you probably have to provide them with some tools to do that work. So the guidance document not only tells folks how to do decontamination specific to gear and those sorts of things, it also shows them how to assess their risk, and then based on that risk, make the appropriate choices for decontamination. So, for example, a lot of folks are probably, maybe doing work that's in the low risk. They're only going to one site a week. They're not really going to be bouncing around from water body to water body or site to site. In that case, we encourage them and tell them that inspecting their gear, the clothes in their vehicles, and cleaning them, and if they're doing aquatic work, draining, rinsing, and drying are the necessary steps that they need to take. And taking just those steps alone will really get them, well on their way to not spreading invasive species around the state. Of course, there are also higher risk activities and higher risk sites. So if folks are going to multiple sites in a day, or they're knowing they're going to come in contact with invasive species, they're bumping up their risk level, and therefore they need to take some action that's higher than just that cleaning and inspecting step. And they may need to do some disinfection, which is laid out in the guidance document, and maybe bleach, high pressure, heated wash, motor flushing, those sorts of things. One of the other things that the policy and the guidance document itself really does nicely is it helps folks to think about their risk and reduce their risk ahead of time. So maybe keeping them in a lower risk. So visiting those non-infested sites first. Some of the similar things that Maureen mentioned. Working headwater downstream through a chain of lakes or through a watershed. Just avoiding contact with invasive species. Simple things like parking on the parking lot and walking on the sidewalk rather than driving through a field to get to your site. Some of those sort of things are also highlighted in that guidance document. So those are the ways we try to address sort of the wide range of work that this policy needs to cover. As far as getting folks to go out and start doing that disinfection and decontamination, it's laid out in the policy that every group will be doing their own thing. So what I'll talk about is the Department of Environmental Quality Water Resources Division, since that's where I'm housed, and we've been reaching out to other DEQ groups as well. But folks out there doing this work have varying degrees of exposure to decontamination. There are folks who work on contaminated sites who already do decontamination, not for invasive species, but for other things. So they're really familiar with decontamination, and it's a pretty easy thing for them to pick up and roll with. Other folks haven't really had to think about that. They are less familiar with it, maybe not so much comfortable with it. And so we've taken the initiative not only to just send out email messages, but we're heading out to field staff locations to talk to staff and present them with information on invasive species and decontamination, and then the policy itself. And really, we try to give them a pretty simple message: don't spread invasive species. That decontamination shouldn't be overly burdensome. It should be fairly simple. Inspecting, cleaning, making sure you're not moving things around, and that identification of invasives is not always necessary. If you're doing that cleaning and inspecting, you're probably going a long way to remove invasives. So another thing, the third and last piece for the challenge for us was giving folks the tools to succeed, and not so much a challenge, but it's something that you should be aware of and thinking about when you're trying to implement some decontamination, is that it's not necessarily an inexpensive thing to do. We, in 2015, the three departments pulled together and worked on purchasing and distributing heated pressure washers across the state to field offices, so the folks out there have access to them and the ability to use them. And so that is an example, cost right around $300,000 to do. So pretty big chunk of money to get out there, but an important thing. So we pulled together and got that done. On a smaller scale, the Water Resources Division in Department of Environmental Quality also wanted to push out decon kits to individual staff that go out into the field. So we purchased the necessary materials to develop 150 kits and get those out to field staff, and that cost about $3,000 just for those kits. And then we also bought an additional heated pressure washer, some bleach, and some vacuums and things like that for folks, which is what the other materials are. And so before I wrap up, I just want to sort of talk a little bit more about the guidance document itself. You know, one of the really neat things about this is some of the spin-offs that have come out of it. Water Resources Division is working on, or has already started to incorporate some decontamination requirements into grants and contracts. And also we've been trying to use it as an education and an outreach tool. We get folks asking us about decontamination, and we can send them right to this document so they can see everything that they might need to do and be able to assess risk themselves. And with that, I will turn it back over to you, Erica. I have on the bottom of the page my email address and a link to the invasive species webpage, michigan.gov/invasives, and that is another collaborative effort by the Aquatic Invasive Species and Terrestrial Species core teams. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Tom. And just a reminder to attendees on the webinar, if you have a question, please go ahead and type those into the questions box in the GoToWebinar dashboard. Tom, we haven't received any questions yet, so I'm going to move on to our third and final presenter for this afternoon, and that is Kelly Pennington. Kelly joined the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources Invasive Species Program in 2014 as the Aquatic Invasive Species Prevention Consultant, coordinating the state's work to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species into and around Minnesota. Previously, she spent 4 years working on the U.S. Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation in Washington, D.C., and there she worked on issues including the oil well blowout in the Gulf of Mexico, fisheries management, federal agency budgets, weather satellites, and impacts of climate change on oceans. Kelly holds a PhD in conservation biology from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, and a bachelor's in environmental studies from Macalester College in St. Paul. So Kelly, we should be all set for you to go ahead and give your presentation.
Great, thank you. And thanks for hosting this webinar today. So Erica mentioned the post to the Invasive Mussel Collaborative listserv that started some of this inquiry, and that was from me. And I just wanted to thank everyone who is part of that community, because we did, like she said, get a really overwhelming response, and one that spurred this sort of spin-off project. So thanks to everyone who chimed in, and thanks to Erica and Ceci for taking that on. We really appreciate that. So I'm going to approach the subject of decontamination protocols from the perspective of preventing the spread of aquatic invasive species like zebra mussels. So I'm going to talk about how we think about prevention and, when necessary, decontamination in a few different contexts. I'm going to give a little overview of our regulations, talk about inspection and decontamination for the public, certain activities that we permit, and that include some prevention and decontamination steps. And finally, I'll address some of the protocols for our agency staff in Minnesota. Some of our aquatic invasive species prevention regulations include that it's illegal in Minnesota to transport water, plants, or prohibited invasive species, which includes zebra mussels. And that also includes dead or alive prohibited invasive species that it's illegal to transport. We have a watercraft inspection program authorized by statute, and we can also list infested waters where we've either confirmed certain aquatic invasive species, and we also list some waters where they're connected to confirmed waters. That especially comes into play with zebra mussels, where we'll list a connected water as infested. So those lakes and rivers that are listed as infested are subject to some different regulations for activities like bait harvest, commercial fishing, and water appropriation. And that list is public and also used by the public and by our staff to help plan activities in order to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. We also have an affirmation, which is something that's printed on in-state watercraft licenses and out-of-state fishing licenses. And the person, the licensee who gets that document, has to sign a small card that says the following: I understand that Minnesota law requires me to clean aquatic plants and prohibited invasive species from watercraft, drain lake or river water from all equipment and keep drain plugs out during transport, and dispose of unwanted bait in the trash, not in the water. So that focuses on our clean, drain, dispose message. That's consistent with our regulations in Minnesota, and is also, I would say, the foundation of what we recommend generally to the public, and also what we use for our basic internal guidelines. We also in Minnesota have a 21-day restriction on moving docks and lifts. So docks and lifts must be out of the water for 21 days before they can be installed in another body of water. And even given that 21-day wait time, those water-related equipments like docks and lifts still need to comply with the regulations about not moving zebra mussels. So even if you've had your dock or lift out over the winter, you still can't move it if it has attached zebra mussels. You would still have to scrape or use some kind of other method to get rid of those dead or alive zebra mussels. Our watercraft inspection program is one of the main ways that we interact with and educate the public in Minnesota about how to inspect and decontaminate their own field gear, which includes a lot of this water-related equipment like you see here, watercraft, trailers. In Minnesota, our watercraft inspection program began in 1992. And while it started more as an education and outreach tool, now inspectors can require watercraft users to decontaminate before they launch, as well as requiring decontamination of watercraft when we have a decontamination unit available on site. In 2016, we had over 1,000 inspectors statewide. Only about 116 of those were DNR employed inspectors, but another 800 plus were trained by DNR under delegation agreements. So we have authority not only to conduct our own watercraft inspection program, but also to delegate that authority to tribes and local governments who have a delegation agreement that includes a program plan and approved by DNR, and they'll also agree through that process to follow DNR manuals and training. So with that large core of inspectors statewide, in 2016, those individuals inspected over 400,000 watercraft and trailers at accesses in Minnesota. We also offer free high-pressure hot water decontamination at what we're calling courtesy inspection and decontamination stations. So we have a website now on our DNR website that allows people to search by day and area of the state where this courtesy decontamination service will be offered by inspectors, which is a good option for people who are moving their water-related equipment from one place to another, but who may not be encountering an inspector right at the accesses that they're using. We also issue permits, which, like I said, contain some conditions related to both prevention and decontamination for a number of groups. I'll focus on a couple during this presentation: lake service providers and people who harvest bait. We also have a number of permits for people who want to do those other things that are generally illegal in Minnesota, including possessing or transporting prohibited invasive species, aquatic plants, or water. The Lake Service Provider Permit Program has been around since 2012. This includes people who install or remove equipment from lakes and rivers in Minnesota. The most common example of this is probably like dock and lift installers. And currently, there's over 1,000 businesses who've been trained and permitted under this program. So permittees receive training from DNR. They can receive decontamination training if they have specific decontamination equipment at their business. But lake service providers are required to decontaminate equipment before they install it back into a lake or river. Their permits give them some authority to transport invasive species like zebra mussels on their equipment, but they need to remove the zebra mussels and use hot water or high pressure rinse to do that, or scraping. We also issue licenses to people in Minnesota who harvest bait fish or leeches from waters in the state. And all commercial bait harvesters now have to take an aquatic invasive species training, which introduces them to the issue and some of the basic prevention steps that they can take no matter where they're harvesting. If someone wants to harvest minnows in an infested water, one that's on our infested waters list, they need a special permit. And that subjects them to a few more conditions, which in particular, they need to tag their gear. You can see here there's a orange tag right there on the gear in the picture, and have dedicated gear for different types of infested waters so that we know that's not moving from one place to another. But in addition to that, in zebra mussel waters in particular, there's a closed season over the summer when the transport of water from zebra mussel infested waters is most risky and when they're reproducing. And we also don't allow bait dealers to use traps in zebra mussel waters because of the risk of zebra mussels attaching to that equipment and being difficult to either detect or remove. Permittees are also required to remove all the plants, brush off mud and any other debris. And similar to the lake service providers, they're allowed to transport their equipment back to their business location in order to decontaminate it, but they're not allowed to take it away from that location with anything like zebra mussels attached to it. Now we're getting to some of our own agency protocols here at the Department of Natural Resources. We've had an agency operational order since 2007, which applies to both terrestrial and aquatic invasive species and requires activities by DNR staff and our grantees or contractors to take certain actions to prevent the spread of aquatic or terrestrial invasive species. This operational order also requires each of our divisions to develop their own guidelines to specifically address the risks of certain activities and how we can best mitigate those. So again, our agency protocols focus on assessing the risk of an activity and taking prevention steps when one is carrying out the activity. Just a couple examples of some of the activity-specific guidelines in our DNR division guidelines for this operational order. Our first, scuba diving, which the main steps to decontaminate are to rinse with hot water and to dry, specifically for those pieces of equipment. And for all of the activities, there's general guidelines, which again contain things like reducing your risk by visiting uninfested water bodies first, using separate sets of gear whenever possible, and taking the basic clean, drain, dispose steps that we recommend for everyone. Our Division of Fisheries is obviously out working in waters of the state all the time when they're not covered with ice and sometimes when they are. And they have separate guidelines for lots of specific activities, including fish stocking, hatcheries, and their survey work. Their decontamination guidelines, again, include many of the basics like scrape, power spray, freeze, and dry. And our fisheries division is very careful to use separate gear in known infested waters and has lots of sets of gear that they dedicate to different types of water bodies. Also, as part of our operational order, DNR offices acquired equipment to decontaminate gear, like the power washer pictured here. And our staff can find a map of offices with power washers on our website. Then just to follow up on how effective some of these approaches have been. At our most recent seasons, we've seen that 96% of boaters are arriving at an access with an inspector complying with invasive species laws. They've got their drain plug out. And within the agency, a survey just from this year found that about 83% of our staff are familiar with what the operational order requires them to do. Over 90% are regularly cleaning their gear and equipment, and 90% of the staff report that they have access to the equipment that they need to prevent and decontaminate. So that's mostly good news, but also gives us some feedback on where we can improve access and training for some of those staff that still feel that they don't have the tools to join in preventing the spread of aquatic and terrestrial invasive species. And then from the zebra mussel perspective, we've only got confirmed zebra mussels in less than 1% of Minnesota's 11,000 plus lakes. We have less than 2% of Minnesota lakes listed as infested, so that gives you some indication that we do have a fair number of listed infested waters where we haven't actually confirmed zebra mussels, but because they're closely connected to somewhere where we have, we're taking that extra precautionary step to ask people, both at the agency and in other groups, to treat them as though they may be more risky. And that concludes my talk. Again, my email is on this slide. If anyone would like to follow up after this, I'd be happy to. And thanks for your time.
Thanks, Kelly. That concludes our presentations for today, and so we'll move on now to answering your questions and respond to any comments that you may have. We have received a couple questions, but again, encourage folks on the webinar to write those in and submit them to us so we can answer them. And that's through the questions box of the GoToWebinar dashboard. So the first question I have is for Maureen. Maureen, you mentioned there was a DNR 2-page document versus the longer version on the species-specific information. Is that available to the public?
Yeah, it sure is. Some of those screens that I showed you from the DNR website, if you just go to our DNR website and in the search bar type in disinfection, you will see that web page, and there's links to it. There's a link to our there's a link to the manual code, a link to the best management practices document. Within the best management practice document are those species tables, but then there's also a separate PDF with just the species table. That's also a link right on that web page. We're going to be reformatting that web page in the next month to make it more intuitive too, but it's all there.
Thanks. So this question I'm going to open up to all three of you. Do you have, or maybe I'll start with Maureen again and then go to Tom and Kelly. In your manual, do you have language related to the disposal of chemicals used in decontamination? The question asker mentioned that sometimes they have large volumes that they're dealing with.
We do have language about disposal. I'll have to look to see exactly what, but that you have to rinse it with lots of water. We also go into more detail in our best management practices document. Can I take a second to peek at it while the others answer too?
Sure. Tom, do you have any guidelines in your policy related to disposal?
If I'm remembering correctly, we tell folks they need to dispose of it down a drain that goes to a wastewater treatment plant, or down a sink or something like that. I don't remember if that's maybe not something that someone with very large quantities is going to be able to easily do, but that's how we approach it most of the time. It's folks out with a couple gallons of a dilute bleach solution is sort of where we were coming from. I don't believe we have anything for large options, but I could be mistaken.
And Kelly, does Minnesota have any guidelines related to disposal?
Not that I'm aware of. And part of the reason that we asked the question to the Invasive Mussel Collaborative listserv is that so many of our decontamination recommendations do focus simply on the clean drain, use hot water and high pressure rinse. So I'd have to look into that more.
I would just offer up for the others, for people listening on the webinar, if you are aware of disposal information and want to submit that to us via email or to the listserv, we can communicate that out and or put it on the Mussel Collaborative website if there's other information out there that you're aware of regarding guidelines for disposal. Maureen, did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah, in our best management practices document, we do cover disposal for each of the methods, but we don't say large amounts, but a lot of it's just with the sanitary sewer and flushing with water, so I think it would be consulting like the sewer district, if it would depend on how much. Is that sufficient?
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to go on to the next question that we have. It seemed like from the presentation that currently only Wisconsin is using Vercon. Is that correct? So Kelly or Tom, are folks in your state using Vercon?
We do use some Vercon. The fisheries folks use it mainly for VHS, and some of our other staff that are in systems where VHS may be more of a concern, which is a viral fish disease. We do also use it currently with the work that we're doing in the areas that we know have New Zealand mud snails in it.
My understanding is that, this is Kelly, that we're similar to Michigan with respect to using it in some VHS areas.
And in Wisconsin,
Go ahead,
Wisconsin,
Maureen.
yeah, we use it with New Zealand mud snail waters, and then all of our fish hatcheries use it in everything that they do. And I'm assuming Minnesota does that too. And then any field staff who are in a water they suspect could have New Zealand mud snails or one of the invaders. And some staff are using it to clean their boat motors because it's less harmful than bleach to the boat motor. They'll put their motor inside of a tub and run it through water that has the Vercon in it. I don't know how widely used that is though.
Maureen, I'm going to take a chance and pass this question to you. Can you clarify the difference between Vercon and quaternary ammonium? Or am I putting you on the spot?
You're putting me on the spot a little bit.
So I'll just take a minute and say that we will post, so the decontamination quick guide that we mentioned at the beginning that outlines the methods and the active ingredients is on our website. And also the resources and references that were mentioned during this webinar, we will post link to them on the website on the where the webinar recording and summary of this webinar are. So for folks who are interested in some of the documents that have been talked about we'll post links to those on the website. And we'll clarify that that information will clarify the difference between the FERCON and the quaternary ammonium.
I can kind of answer a little bit of the question. The quaternary ammonium, is that the same as essentially what the active ingredient is in 409? I'm not sure who would have asked the question, but we combined our best management practice document with Michigan's like disinfection guidance, because they had a lot of really good stuff in there, and they had looked at a dimethyl benzyl ammonium chloride, which it seems like that is a quaternary compound, and we integrated that with our best management practices, and it turns out that's that same active ingredient in 409 which is also effective to kill New Zealand mud snails, and we're just trying to make this information available to people. We never finished. We still need to look at more of the literature for that. It was just difficult to find some things, but I think that's definitely something that we can use. We don't know if it's effective for everything, but I think there's a good chance that the Fish and Wildlife Service already has done some of this, so it'd be good to consult them too. And I'm not sure who you start with, but I hope that helps at least a little bit.
Thanks, Maureen. And we did have one of our participants, Kelly Stockton, write in with a comment on this issue, noting that Vercon is an oxidizing compound and QACs are ammonia-based. So Vercon breaks down into biosalts and QACs are not biodegradable. So thank you for that, Kelly.
Yeah, Kelly's been really great to work with. Hi, Kelly.
All right, I believe we have answered all of the questions that have come in. Thank you, Maureen, Kelly, and Tom. Before we conclude, I will just give you, if there's anything else you thought of that you wanted to mention or reference on this webinar, I'll give the three of you one last chance to make any closing comments, but otherwise we can wrap up for today. So Maureen, Kelly, or Tom, any other closing thoughts that you want to offer?
I'll just say thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Erica, and everyone.
All right, well, thank you again to all of our presenters and all of the participants on the webinar today. As a final reminder, again, the webinar is recorded and will be posted on the Muscle Collaborative website with the links to the documents and information that we've referenced today. And if you have any additional follow-up questions or comments, please feel free to contact us. Thank you very much.